Here's a segment from a recent Gun Talk radio episode. You can listen to all the Gun Talk radio podcasts however you tune in, or check out guntalk.com for more. One of the things that is perplexing and maddening and frustrating, and I'll just be honest, it's frustrating, for me, having covered this for decades, is how a particular set of data, which is very clear, a set of numbers, can be not just ignored, but turned upside down and denigrated and then made to look like it's not even true. And it seems to be that that's what often comes from the gun ban academics, if you will. And joining me to explain that, because he's done a fabulous job of dissecting it, David Yamane joins us. David, thank you, and welcome back.
Well, thanks so much for having me. It's always a privilege.
Well, first of all, let's tell people who you are. Why don't you run through a little bit of that?
Sure. Professor of sociology at Wake Forest University in North Carolina. And for the past, now more than 10 years, I've been studying what Michael Bain called gun culture 2.0, so the defensive core of American gun ownership today.
Okay, well, you do a lot of good work, and I love the stuff you do, because you turn it upside down, you look at it, you take it apart, you put it on the table, you dissect it like a professor would. And you just did something that inherently I have kind of understood for many years, but I've never taken the time to say, how do they get from A to Z or from data to nonsense when the academics look at self-defense gun uses? You want to kind of just walk us through that?
Sure. So, I have some of the same, responses to this as you do, and I've been looking at gun culture from the perspective that I say guns are normal and normal people use guns. So that sets me apart from most of the scholars who are looking at the issue. And just over the years of sort of reading study after study, which all seem to be coming from the same perspective, but the overarching viewpoint has never really been articulated. So, last week on my YouTube channel, I started a series in which I've just trying to distill the logic of the underlying approach that most scholars take to guns, and I call it the standard model of explaining the irrationality of defensive gun ownership, and that really reflects that perspective.
Well, we start off, those of us who've looked at this for many years, and said, okay, we have, pick a number, whatever the number is, 2.5 million defensive gun uses a year. Seems like a pretty fair in-the-middle number. Call it 1.6, call it whatever you want. And this has been steady decade after decade. So we say, okay, it seems to us this works, this is rational, because we have the data to support this. And somehow they go from what you and I would probably say, this is rational to have a gun for self-defense, and they take a number of steps to end up at the point where they say it's totally irrational to have a gun for self-defense. What are those steps? How do they get from A to Z?
Sure. So the first point is they do recognize that the dominant reason for gun ownership today is self-defense, and so no problem there. That's the first point. But then, unlike some of the numbers you just shared, they tend to look at the lowest estimate of defensive gun use, which comes out of a 2015 study that's got some issues that I'll talk about next week. But, they use the minimum estimate of defensive gun use. And so in doing that, they discount the need for guns for self-defense and the utility of guns for self-defense. So that's the one of the key first steps. And then the next step towards irrationality is that they talk about the ways in which bringing a gun into your home introduces more risk without any offsetting benefits. And so, if you say guns have no use for self-defense, but guns are associated with other negative outcomes,
right,
then defensive gun ownership isn't a rational choice, but it's an irrational choice.
Sure. If you say, okay, there's no benefit, and all we see is the downsides, it's like saying, okay, all we see, and we hear this all the time, but a lot of people think guns equal crime, because that's all I hear, gun crime, and they're not hearing about self-defense gun use. So in their minds, they go, well, there's no reason to have a gun because all they're used for is to commit murder. And so I guess it would follow in that weird logic. I can understand how they could get there.
Yeah. I think there's also an assumption there that risk of those negative outcomes, whether it's homicide, suicide, accidental death, or injury, are sort of evenly distributed across all gun owners, when we know, in fact, that these things are extremely concentrated among certain types of people. So, it's not like you as a gun owner or I as a gun owner have the same risk of those negative outcomes as just any person. So that's also, key to that point of, saying the opposite is true of owning guns. It doesn't have a utility. It actually has a dysfunction. But that, I think that risk is something that we all attempt to mitigate. You do a lot of obvious work, helping people understanding how to live with guns safely, and lots of people do that within the gun community, but that's not really factored into this model at all.
Interesting. I've adopted this phrase of kind of playing off the other to say it's their don't say gang idea. If you simply pretend that gangs don't exist, you can say that gang shootings are just normal people like you and me, and that applies to all of us, when in point of fact, most murders are committed by people with criminal records, usually long criminal records, committed by people who are in gangs. Even, and if you start really drilling down, even a lot of accidental shootings at home are people, if you start drilling down, who have criminal records. And Lord knows that a lot of the home invasions are criminals attacking criminals in their homes. So if you ignore all of that, you can get a really skewed view of this.
Yeah, definitely. And I think, it's a case of, always choosing the data that's going to present the issue in the worst possible light for gun owners. And, I certainly recognize that, guns are lethal weapons. If they weren't lethal, as Tom Gibbons said, they wouldn't be much use to us.
That's right.
But that doesn't mean that, we can't do things to live with those guns in ways that are safe and highlight the benefits that we derive from them, whether actual or potential, right? I mean, I've never used my gun to defend myself. I hope I never do. But that doesn't mean that I'm irrational for having it just because I've never used it.
Let me ask you, you live and work in the world of academia. And I know you have some ideas about this. How does one, so many in academia, get to the point of being completely dismissive of the data on this?
I think it's a selective reading, right? So you have a choice of, I'm going to use a study that says 50,000, or I'm going to use a study that says 1.6 million. So if you lean towards the control side, that 50,000 number is just going to look a lot more attractive to you. You'll be more critical of the other number. If we lean the other way, the opposite is true. And so, unfortunately, people are driven by their preconceptions about things, and that leads them not necessarily to weigh all of the evidence equally. And, I spend time with these people. I'm friends with some of them, and, it's just interesting that they are so committed to reducing these negative outcomes with guns that it really profoundly drives the way that they approach the questions that they ask and the answers that they find.
Well, and what's in it for me, which is always the end of all of these, is why do we care about this? It's because these quote-unquote studies they do and the data, with quotes around it, that they put out affect eventually how the media covers it, and then that affects how the public views it, or what they quote-unquote know to be true. And so by slanting things this way, they actually are changing public perception, and that's how you change laws.
Yeah, there were some commenters on what I presented. It was like, that's just for academics. No one really cares what you academics have to say about this. But in fact, as you suggested, if you look at the narratives that often appear in the media, certainly the narratives that are put forward by groups like Brady in Everytown, it has the same structure as this argument. This is not just an academic matter. This is the way that a lot of people think about guns, that defensive gun use is minimal, that lots of bad things happen with guns, therefore there's no rational basis for defensive gun ownership.
The reality is the goal, the intention, is to change the baseline of knowledge about guns so that they can then take action on it. David, I'm up against my break here. Tell people how they can follow you and how they can read you and look at your YouTube channel.
Absolutely. So YouTube channel is lightoverheat.com, and my blog is gunculture2.0.com.
There you go. David Yamane, Professor, thank you so much for this. Please keep doing what you're doing. It is very important work.
Thank you, Tom. It's nice talking to you.